Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Today, I wanted to put together a quick guide for those of you that are Path of Exile 2 players that are interested in giving the first game a bit of a shot during the upcoming Legacy of Phrecia event. Or for that matter, for those of you that are interested in playing Path of Exile 1 in a more ongoing basis, maybe you'll find that you end up preferring it to the newer game. Path of Exile 1 has been around for a literal decade, and as a result, it has an enormous amount of complexity creep that's built up. What I want to do in this video is showcase some of the most important changes, but also to make clear that there is a lot of additional depth that you can opt into discovering. What I really recommend though, is that you don't try to get a broad sense of everything that's in Path of Exile 1. Instead, what I recommend that you do is find one area of the game that interests you, and until you get to the point that you're like level 85 or so, you can just dabble in everything. But at some point, you're going to find one of those areas of side content really interests you. What you want to do then is become an expert in that one area. You don't really want to be a jack of all trades, because jacks of all trades aren't really rewarded in POE 1. You want to be a specialist in one particular area of the game. Now, probably the biggest single change in Path of Exile 1 is what exactly is going on with the socketing system. In Path of Exile 2, sockets are something that are on your character. You put a skill gem into them, and inside that skill gem, you can put 2, 3, 4, or 5 support gems, depending upon the specific attributes of the skill gem in question. In Path of Exile 1, instead, you have sockets on your items. Most item slots allow 4 sockets, for example, your gloves, your boots, your helmet. Some item sockets allow only 3. This is things that go into one hand, or at least it's most things that go into one hand. Like with everything in Path of Exile 1, there are a few exceptions. Then, your chest piece can hold 6. Now, getting 6 sockets on an item is not super rare, but the thing that's important is that those sockets also have to be linked. You'll notice on this axe that there is a stylized linkage between the top left socket, the top right socket, and another one between the top right and the bottom right. However, you'll also notice, and this is a deliberate choice on my behalf, that on the boots, that the top left, top right, and bottom right sockets are linked, but there is no stylized link connecting to the bottom left socket. The reason for this is that in Path of Exile 1, support gems only work if they are socketed in the same piece of equipment and if there is an unbroken link between them. For instance, this cruelty support, this volatility support, this chance to bleed support, this awakened brutality support, and this melee physical damage support, all of them are linked together to this eviscerate skill gem. And as a result, they're able to benefit this eviscerate skill gem. However, if you have a look in the boots, you'll notice that this vulnerability is actually intentionally not linked to this cast when damage taken support. Now, there's a number of reasons cast when damage taken wouldn't work on vulnerability, so it's not actually important at the moment, but if I was to make some changes to this build, that might end up being a factor. For that reason, I've intentionally left this unlinked. There are currency items that can randomize the sockets and the links on an item. These are the Jeweler's Orbs and the Fusing Orb, respectively. Jeweler's Orbs are much more common than even lesser Jeweler's Orbs are in Path of Exile 2. However, they have an RNG effect. They don't just add 1 to the number of sockets on an item. Instead, they randomize the number of sockets on an item. There's a pretty strong bias against getting 6. And then, once you start applying Orbs of Fusing, you will then be able to randomize the number of links that are present on that item. Now, there will be a weak bias against getting 4, a strong bias against getting 5, and an overwhelming bias against getting a perfect 6 links, like you see here on Corruption Suit, this royal plate. That is something that becomes somewhat of an endgame goal, not necessarily something that's super endgame, but this is something that in Path of Exile 1, you'll get your hands on a 6 link about the time that in Path of Exile 2, you'd be looking at having 2 gems that have greater Jeweler's Orbs applied to them, and none that have perfect Jeweler's Orbs applied to them. One of the key things to note here is that you will not be able to get as many 6 links as you want. On many builds, you'll only be able to have 1, such as my Eviscerate on this character. On other builds, you'll be able to have 2, but that will be because you're using a 2-handed weapon. Additionally, one of the really interesting things that this allows is that you can find modifiers on items, such as +1 to the level of socketed AoE gems that's found on this Miracle Crown Conqueror's helmet, that will actually modify the gems that are present inside that one item. That will apply both to skill gems that have the AoE tag, but also it will apply to support gems that happen to have the AoE tag, if you can find any of those. While we're on the topic of the way that gems differ from Path of Exile 1 to Path of Exile 2, Path of Exile 2 has support gems that are all basically the same. Any 2 Fire Mastery gems are the same as each other. In Path of Exile 1, support gems are something that can level up, just like a normal gem can. In fact, the whole gem leveling mechanics are different in Path of Exile 1 to 2. And on top of that, they can gain quality. Getting 20 quality on your support gems is something that tends to be quite worthwhile doing, but it's not super high priority, and so it's something you'll try to get maybe about the time you hit level 90 or so. Now, one of the key things you want to know though, there are some really special support gems in Path of Exile 1. In Path of Exile 2, all the support gems are pretty easy to get, at least once you're at endgame. In Path of Exile 1, anything with Awakened in the name, or anything with the exceptional tag on it, you'll see the tags on Awakened added chaos damage support that you see here, they're chaos and support. Anything that either has the exceptional tag or that is Awakened in the name, these tend to be quite valuable. They have different rules to normal gems, they require much more gem XP than normal gems do, and they can also be really, really good. Ultimately, this just comes to the fact that Path of Exile 1 has had much longer to experiment with different ways of iterating on the core systems. The core systems of PoE 1 and 2 are not massively different when it comes to gems, but there's just been a lot more iteration, a lot more pushing around at the edges in Path of Exile 1 than there has been in 2, because the game has been going for a decade. So that is the majority of the differences with gems, but there's one more important one, and that is that gem sockets that you've seen are blue, red, or green, or in weird situations they can be white. Gems are blue, red, or green, or in weird situations they can be white. Now, blue gems can only go into blue sockets, red gems only into red sockets, green gems into green sockets, but white gems and white sockets are wildcards. So a white gem can go into a blue, red, green, or a white socket, and a blue, red, green, or a white gem can go into a white socket. You'll see here that every single socket on Corruption Suit Royal Plate is red. Now that is not some sort of fluke. Because the strength requirement on this is extremely high, but there is no dexterity requirement, no intelligence requirement, this means there is a strong bias towards every socket on this item being red. If instead it had a high dexterity requirement, such as a Zodiac Leather, then there would be a strong bias towards every socket being green, and if it had a strong intelligence requirement, such as the Twilight Regalia, then it would have a strong bias towards every socket being blue. Just like in Path of Exile 2, there are hybrid armors as well. For example, a Necrotic armor is the highest tier dexterity and intelligence item, and that will have a high dex and a high int requirement, and that will end up meaning that you have a strong bias towards both blue and green sockets, and not very many red ones will roll. Now you can re-roll the colors that are present, but this is an RNG process, and doing so requires the Chromatic Orb, one of the other new currency items that exists in Path of Exile 1. While we're talking about currency items, let's talk about some of the biggest changes from Path of Exile 1 to 2. Before we start looking at the differences in crafting orbs that exist in Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2, Path of Exile 1 has a lot more, including really powerful effects like the Fracturing Orb that there's no equivalent to in PoE 2. But in Path of Exile 1, the game developers have made a very different choice. In PoE 2, the game developers have decided they want to keep the limits on how good crafting can be, and the intention there is they want it so that you can't completely obsolete every rare item that drops on the ground. In Path of Exile 1, crafting is allowed to exceed that limit, so it's allowed to get to the point that rare items that drop on the ground are just complete and utter garbage unless they have some use as a rare crafting reagent themselves. For example, you don't pick up necrotic armors that drop at high level, even though necrotic armor is one of the best armor bases in the game. You don't pick these up and identify them hoping you get something that's almost a good item already. You pick them up if they have a use in crafting a perfect necrotic armor, or not even necessarily a perfect one, but one that's reasonably close to it. Now, it's not like it's this way from the start of the game. Early on in the game, you will just be picking up items off the ground, you'll be identifying them, you'll be putting them on if they're better than what you've got. But once you reach a point in endgame, maybe about the time you start tackling level 80 content, which is a bit earlier than it is in Path of Exile 2, you will reach a point where you are just no longer interested in the mods that are already on an item. Now, there's a few other things that really amp this up. When we get to talking about the Scouring Orb and the Orb of Alteration, you'll see more. And in particular, we have Recombination, which is something that exists in the Settlers League, and it will also exist in the upcoming Legacy of Phrecia event. These are some of the most powerful crafting mechanisms in the game. They are extremely complicated, and it's one of those things where you probably want to learn 1 or 2 sections of the game. You can't go wrong learning recombinators there. Now, this is not going to cover every single change that exists between the two games. However, The Exalted Orb. This thing does the same thing in Path of Exile 1 that it does in Path of Exile 2. The difference is it's really rare in PoE 1. It's the same rarity as the Divine Orb, but whilst the Divine Orb is super valuable in Path of Exile 1 just like it is in Path of Exile 2, the Exalted Orb is only middling price in Path of Exile 1. You can think of this as being maybe 1/15th of a Divine Orb. It's certainly not worthless, but it's also not a super big investment to put onto an item. Ultimately, these are just a nice drop to get, but they are very, very rare in a way they aren't in Path of Exile 2. Second change I want to point out is the existence of the Orb of Alteration and the Scouring Orb. Now these two allow you to essentially reset an item in a way that's not possible in Path of Exile 2. Applying an Orb of Scouring to an item removes all modifiers from it and turns it from rare or magic down into a mundane item. This is an effect that flat out does not exist in Path of Exile 2, and the Orb of Scouring, whilst it's not common, it's not super rare either. The Alteration Orb is even cheaper. These are really common. In fact, this is one of the most common currency items in the game. And what it does is it randomizes the mods that are present on a magic item. So in Path of Exile 2 terms, this is like annulling every mod off the magic item, and then flipping a coin. Heads, you apply 1 augmentation orb to it. Tails, you apply 2. This is nothing that you can't mimic in Path of Exile 2 with currency, but it's something that is much easier because Orbs of Alteration are common. One of the consequences of this is a lot of the most desirable single mods that exist are much rarer than anything that exists in Path of Exile. Another major currency change is the Chaos Orb. The Chaos Orb is the primary currency for small trades in Path of Exile 1, much like the Exalted Orb has been the primary currency in Path of Exile 2 so far. I wouldn't be surprised if the Chaos Orb replaces it in Path of Exile 2 as well, because the number of Exalted Orbs players are demanding is starting to fall. But for the moment, in Path of Exile 2, the Exalt is the primary currency of small trades. In Path of Exile 1, it's a Chaos Orb. You'll notice the Chaos Orb does something else. What it does is it removes all the modifiers on a rare item, then it adds 4, 5, or 6 at random. There is a strong bias towards getting 4, and a weak bias towards getting 5, a strong bias against getting 6. Players have estimated the ratio here as being 8 to 3 to 1, and I believe that's probably exactly correct. I think at this point we also need to talk about Divine Orbs. Divine Orbs are the currency of larger trades, and they have the same core functionality that they have in Path of Exile 2. Actually, it's slightly different. Part of their core functionality in Path of Exile 1 goes to the Blessed Orb instead, but the primary function, which is randomizing explicit modifiers on items, that is something that they can still do. However, the primary use case for them, and the reason Divine Orbs are so valuable in Path of Exile 1, is there are a number of very special crafts that you can put on items. These are 100% deterministic to apply, and they have text like suffixes cannot be changed, prefixes cannot be changed, can have up to 3 crafted modifiers, cannot roll attack modifiers, cannot roll caster modifiers. Fundamentally what these are is something akin to the way that omens allow you to modify crafting in Path of Exile 2. These do it in a very different way. They're quite expensive because Divine Orbs are expensive because these crafts are so good, and this ends up setting the value of Divine Orbs. This is the reason when Divine Orbs are trading for 200 or so Chaos Orbs in Path of Exile 1 as they normally do. This is the reason for that. It's because there are a large number of players who are willing to pay 400 Chaos Orbs to add suffixes cannot be changed onto their item. This also here is the crafting bench. This replaces the rune system from Path of Exile 2. It's something that's a bit more flexible and also has a few nuances. Sometimes it's more powerful, sometimes less powerful. What this will allow you to do, if you've got a rare that has 5 or fewer mods on it, it will allow you to augment them with an additional modifier. These modifiers can be very easily changed, but you can only by default have one of these crafted modifiers on an item. You won't start out with very many choices here, but you'll unlock a lot of them through the campaign. Then there's a lot more that you can unlock in endgame. And if there's a particular one that you'd like to have but you don't have unlocked, you can also look to see whereabouts you might unlock it. For example, I never got Attributes Rank 2, which apparently is found in the Western Forest. I also have never gotten around to getting a few of the other things, including some really good ones, like Avoid Freeze on boots, which can be really, really strong. Some of these bench crafts do require expensive currency items like Exalted Orbs, but none of them require Divine Orbs except for those 5 Metamods that we outlined before. Now there's also a lot of other esoteric currency items that have developed over time in Path of Exile 1. For example, we have the Harbinger's Orb, which can upgrade the tier of a map. We have the Harbinger's Shard. 20 of them becomes a Harbinger's Orb. We have the Blessed Orb, which is like a Divine Orb, but it only applies to implicit modifiers of an item, which are the ones that are above the line separating items. We have the Sacred Orb, which is ridiculously rare, not as valuable as you might think given that it's 20 times as rare as a Divine Orb, but the Sacred Orb is something that can improve an item beyond normal limits, albeit only slightly. We have the Orb of Regret, which allows you to unspec your things on your passive tree, and a whole bunch of other currency items. You don't need to learn all of these for now. They do tell you what they do. The key things you want to know are which ones are super lucrative. Just like Path of Exile 2, the Mirror of Kalandra is the most expensive. Then some of the other really expensive ones, we have the Mirror Shards, a stack of 20 becomes a Mirror of Kalandra. We have the Divine Orb is really expensive. And we have the Veiled Orb, which I have none of in my stash tab at the moment. These are something that's fairly esoteric. And then there's a whole bunch of special currencies down the bottom. In the current league, the Power Rune is quite valuable, but these are going to change all the time. They're not necessarily going to be the same from one Path of Exile league to the next, so I don't want to go into that. But then we also have the Exotic tab, and this is a whole bunch of other weird and wonderful currency items, such as the Hunter's Exalted Orb, the Tainted Blacksmith's Whetstone, the Eldritch Chaos Orb, the Primal Crystallized Life Force, the Orb of Conflict, all sorts of weird and wonderful things. Some of these can be quite valuable, some of them are not. You'll learn about these as you decide to specialize in particular areas of the game. Now, the next thing I think you need to know about is Scarabs. Scarabs are not a thing until you get to endgame, so don't worry about them. They can't drop until you're killing level 68 monsters, and they won't do anything until you're running maps. So you don't need to worry about these until you're in endgame. When you do get to endgame, what Scarabs do is that they go in with a map. So when you go to the map device and you decide, all right, I'm gonna place something in this, you can then also place in some number of Scarabs. These will augment the map in a certain way, and they'll have all sorts of various effects. They vary in rarity. They have 5 different rarity tiers that we know of: common, uncommon, rare, mythic, and extreme. Only one Scarab is extreme rarity, it's the Horned Scarab of Preservation. Most of the other Scarabs that have Horned in the name are mythic rarity, and then the other 3 rarities are not that dissimilar to each other. The drop rates seem to be 300 to 200 to 100 to 10 to 1. To give you a bit of a sense, like the Extreme Scarab is crazy rare, the Mythic Scarabs are quite rare, but then the other 3, they're all within a factor of 3 of each other. Anyways, what these will do is they'll allow you to customize endgame in a way that is just not remotely close to possible in Path of Exile 2. In addition, in the normal game, you can also scale this with your Atlas passive tree. However, if you're playing in the upcoming Legacy of Phrecia event, the Atlas passive tree is being turned off, and this is going to be replaced by a new system. Time will tell whether the new system is better or worse. I think it will be completely and utterly broken, but also that it will be something that will get stale fairly quickly. Who knows, maybe I'll be right, maybe I'll be wrong on that front. Whatever the case, the finding out process will definitely be a lot of fun. But the key thing about the Atlas passive tree, it is much more customizable than it is in the sequel. And related to this is the Atlas of Worlds. In Path of Exile 2, the Atlas is something that you explore throughout, and it continues on procedurally generated in all directions. In Path of Exile 1, the Atlas is finite. These are the connections between the maps. For example, you can see here that the map down here, the Gardens map, that this is linked to the Carcass map, it is linked to the Lair map. And here these are tier 16, but by default these would be tier 1, 2, and they just keep working up towards 16 towards the top. When you start out, you'll have access only to those maps that are closest to the origin point down the bottom, and you want to work your way through this atlas. This is likely also to be changed in the upcoming Legacy of Phrecia event, but essentially the progress through endgame in Path of Exile 1 is that you want to complete all of the atlas at some point. So that's a whole bunch about the endgame, but what about the earlier parts of the game? Because ultimately, that's going to be a part of the game you'll spend a bunch more time in if you're a new player to Path of Exile 1. Well, in Path of Exile 1, there are 10 acts, rather than the 3 that currently exist in Path of Exile 2. And in Path of Exile 2, you've got 3 acts, then you repeat them all on hard mode. So it's like Act 1, 2, 3, then it's Act 1 plus, 2 plus, 3 plus. In Path of Exile 1, it used to work like that, but then they got rid of the repeating the acts and instead just made it so that there's 10 acts. You will notice that Act 6 is very thematically similar to Act 1, Act 7 to Act 2, Act 8 to Act 3, and so on and so forth. They're going to have very similar towns, they're going to have a very similar feel to them, and many of the areas will be reused. However, the biggest difference you'll notice is in Path of Exile 1, the campaign is just much shorter. Even though you got 10 acts instead of 6, it is going to be a lot faster because each of these zones is just much quicker to zoom through. So the next thing we want to talk about is movement speed and just how much faster you feel in Path of Exile 1 than in 2. Path of Exile 2 has a lot of things in place to keep player movement speed under control. Path of Exile 1 kind of lets it rip a little bit. Now, this is on an endgame character. I do have access to a very, very rare belt. Consider it to be Astromantis or Dream Fragment rarity from Path of Exile 2. And that belt, Mage Blood, is allowing one of my flasks to permanently be on. That flask is providing me with 50% movement speed, which is something that doesn't exist in Path of Exile 2. In Path of Exile 1, your flasks can do more than just be a life flask or a mana flask. But on top of that, you're also forced to zoom in more in Path of Exile 1, which makes everything feel faster than it actually is. Your base movement speed of 3.5 meters a second is in both games, it's the same in both games, but in Path of Exile 1, it's going to feel faster than it does in POE 2. The other thing though that is really transformative, in Path of Exile 1, you have movement skills that are spammable, or some of them are spammable like this shield charge here, and they can be incredibly strong at zipping around a map at lightning speed. On top of that, you also have ones that can be instantaneous, such as this here, Frostblink. Now, Frostblink has a cooldown, but there's other skills that you can use that have different strengths and different weaknesses. Frostblink of Wintry Blast is popular, Flame Dash is popular. Frostblink Classic version is probably the most popular at the moment, but they all have their own unique abilities, and ultimately, they're all good at something. Except for Dash. I really hate Dash. Whatever the case, all of them are better than Blink is in Path of Exile 2, and we know how good Blink is. Although I will say that Blink in conjunction with the unique chess piece Temporalis in Path of Exile 2 might actually exceed what you can do in Path of Exile 1. Additionally, player offense can reach points in Path of Exile 1 where killing a monster can detonate a chain reaction that can kill entire screens. Now you can sort of get to that point in Path of Exile 2 through the use of Herald of Ice, a couple of other mechanics, but in Path of Exile 1, it's just simply much more of the gameplay experience. You will also find that Path of Exile 1 maps will contain more events, and on top of having more events, there will also be more monsters. Another thing I want to point out is the passive tree. Now there are two things in Path of Exile 1 that exist that aren't in Path of Exile 2. One of these is Cluster Jewels, one of these is Masteries. Let's start with Masteries. When you allocate one of the large nodes in a cluster, you'll have the option to also allocate a mastery if you want. The intention with these masteries is they're powerful effects that GGG want to be available in multiple spots on the tree, but they don't want you to be able to take multiple times. So for instance, I'm able to take here auras from your skills have 10% increased effect on you. This is a big deal in Path of Exile 1, and I can spec this, and that is something that I can take here. But if I later take another reservation cluster that has another reservation mastery in it, I'm not going to be able to pick the same thing. If I want something else, I have to pick a different option from this drop-down list. The second thing that's new in Path of Exile 1 is Cluster Jewels. These are itemized extensions to the passive tree. This normally would be a jewel socket, and you might think it's something akin to where you've got sockets on the tree in Path of Exile 2, where you can put an Emerald Jewel, or maybe you can put a Time Lost Jewel in there if you've got one, or maybe even a unique jewel. But you can also put these Cluster Jewels, which are rollable, and they will add extensions to the passive tree. The first line on it says adds 8 passive skills. That can be 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12 on a large cluster jewel. If you have a medium one, it's 4, 5, or 6. If you have a small one, it's 2 or 3. And then from there, that will extend the passive tree, and it will also specify what it adds. Added small passive skills grant 12% increased physical damage, but also added small passive skills also grant 5% increased mana regen rate. I don't really care about that. I'm using this because of the other mods that are on it. And then I'm able to allocate 3 additional notables, some of which are quite good. Then you can see I've got a small cluster jewel here. This has the text added small passive skills grant 6% increased mana reservation efficiency of skills. We'll have to come to that in a sec. We've got to talk about auras as one of the other big changes. And then there's a bunch of other mods on it. I just noticed that this is something that could do with an Exalted Orb. Currently it has only 3 mods on it, so I could exalt this and get a 4th mod on it. That would just make it better than it is now. Then we've also got this medium cluster jewel, which is a slightly different setup. And then we've got a normal jewel slot here, which is quite familiar. So there's a whole bunch of additional layers of customization on the passive tree. That said, it's my general opinion that the passive tree in Path of Exile 1, most of it is a bit weaker than what exists in Path of Exile 2. The difference is that there's more access to power in both cluster jewels and also in the Masteries, and probably most of all in the Ascendancies. Ascendancies are stronger in Path of Exile 1 than they are in Path of Exile 2, and you can also get them a little bit easier. But let's quickly go back to that concept of mana reservation and also of auras. And at this point, I would invite you to have a look at my mana bar. You'll see there that I've got 99 of 632 mana, with this curious 533 reserved. The way that auras work in Path of Exile 1, you don't have spirit like you've got in Path of Exile 2. Instead, each aura that you use will consume a percentage of your mana. And as long as that aura is turned on, that mana will be unavailable. So it'll just be permanently reserved, it'll be locked, it can't be used. This can be seen as similar to starting with 100 spirit. So when you start out, you've got 100 spirit, but each percentage of spirit that you lose, it's like 1% of your mana is gone. However, there is also this additional stat that you can get, mana reservation efficiency, which I have a moderate amount of on my character. And what this will do, every point of mana reservation efficiency that you've got makes it so that the amount of mana that is reserved by all of your auras gets decreased. The vast majority of auras in Path of Exile 1 reserve 50% of your maximum mana. There are exceptions. There are a number that reserve 35%. There are a few things that aren't auras but that reserve 25%. There's also a couple of auras, there's just 3 of these, that reserve a flat amount of mana, but overwhelmingly they reserve a percentage of your maximum mana. What 6% mana reservation efficiency does is it means that you would be able to reserve 106% of your mana. So if you've got 1060 mana and you reserve 50% for an aura, instead of that taking up 530 of your maximum mana and tying it off and making it unusable, it only ties up 500 of that maximum mana. If you instead had 180% reservation efficiency, then this would mean that if you had 2800 mana, instead of an aura taking up 1400 of your mana, it's only going to take up 500 of your mana. This means that you've got a lot of flexibility to reserve more auras. And that's important because in Path of Exile 1, auras are unbelievably more powerful than they are in Path of Exile 2. Have a look at this Determination gem. This is nothing special. This is just a level 20 gem. Level 20 gems are much easier to come by in Path of Exile 1 than they are in 2. And you and nearby allies gain 1077 additional armor and 50% more armor. Now, armor is a meme in Path of Exile 2 at the moment, but that's just because I haven't got the numbers right on it. Armor is reasonably strong in Path of Exile 1. It's not unbelievably strong, but it's worth investing in, and that's exactly what I've done on this character. So, Determination is something that is made cheaper because of all the mana reservation efficiency I've got. In fact, instead of costing 50% of my maximum mana, it's only costing 31.94. That's still no joke. That's still a very severely limiting in terms of the amount of other things that I can reserve against mana, but it's something that's still a very, very big deal in terms of giving me a bunch of extra power. The last thing I want to point out is that Path of Exile 1 has a ridiculous number of unique items to explore. Some of these will be familiar to a Path of Exile 2 player, such as Rizlatha's Coil here, but some of them will be brand new. For example, Venipuncture. Venipuncture has some other techs, like in this case, because it's corrupted, it's got Determination, has 17% increased aura effect. Orbs do different things in Path of Exile 1 to what you're familiar with from 2, but also has a whole bunch of effects that modify the way bleed affects enemies. Bleed is a bit stronger in Path of Exile 1 than in 2, and this ends up being perfect for my character, although it's not considered a generally very good unique item. But it seems like the Surrender here that I really want to point out. This is something that's phenomenally strong, and there's a whole bunch of items just like it. A huge, huge, huge effect if you can set up a situation, if you can engineer a scenario where you are blocking often, then recover 484 life when you block. This can be enormous amounts of burst life recovery on a character, and it means that you can run around in a map, and unless something is doing an overwhelmingly large amount of single target damage, you're probably going to be just fine. There's about 1,000 unique items to discover in Path of Exile 1. They are all well documented. You can have a look on the Path of Exile 1 wiki if you're interested, but you'll find there's a whole bunch of things for different playstyles there. Some of these are near universally considered ridiculously powerful, like Mage Blood, this unique belt that is arguably the best item in the game. Others are more niche but still very powerful, like Aegis Aurora or Ephemeral Edge, And then there's a whole bunch of other things that are far, far, far more situational, such as Chevron's Revelation, Call of the Void, or Voice of the Storm. And that's just looking at one of my characters in this league. There's a whole bunch of other unique items to discover, some of which are good, some of which are also considered to be complete and utter garbage. I will leave all of that up to you. Ultimately, the single biggest difference you'll find when playing Path of Exile 1 is that the game pace is just much faster. This is both a good thing, in that your triumphs happen quicker, but it's also a drawback in that the times that you get absolutely crushed by something, sometimes you haven't had any time to work out that you're in any danger at all. It's more likely in Path of Exile 1 than in 2 for you to just die without feeling like it was fair, without feeling like you could react. But that's just the nature of the game. It is a different game after all. Definitely worth playing, giving it a shot, see how you go. My advice to new players is that you should probably go in without a guide, but go in knowing your first character is going to be an absolute pile of garbage. That you'll be able to play the game for a while, learn a bunch of stuff, then after you find you're no longer having fun, and this point will come at different points for different people. For some people this will come by the time you finish Act 2, for other people this will come by the time you get solidly into Endgame. At that point, start again following a guide. When you follow a guide, you'll be able to replicate your earlier progress really, really fast, and then you'll be able to get all the fun of going in and just figuring things out for yourself. But at the same time, you'll also be able to get the experience of going in as a superpowered character and just absolutely dominating everything. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlobs have interesting results, whether you use them in the sequel or the original game. Fun fact, they're definitely stronger in the sequel.